It's been 4 years since that night, and I still check the door at least 3 times before bed. No matter how exhausted I am, no matter how safe I feel, I always check. Because for a moment, just a moment, I left the door unlocked. And I swear in that sliver of time, something almost got in. I was 16 then. My parents had gone to stay with friends for the night, leaving the house to me, my older brother, and my best friend. It wasn't a big deal. We'd been left alone before. My brother was 17, only a year older, and he had a morning shift at his part-time job, so he went to bed early. That left me and my friend in my room, huddled around my laptop, watching YouTube videos and talking about nothing in particular. We were still awake when the house fell silent. The occasional creak from my brother shifting in his sleep, the hum of the fridge in the kitchen, those sounds became part of the background. It was around 2 a.m. when my friend dozed off, slumped against my bed with his mouth slightly open. I wasn't tired yet, so I kept watching. Something mindless. A gaming video, maybe. That's when I heard it, the metallic clang from outside. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct, carrying through the stillness of the house like a dropped coin in an empty hall. I knew that sound well. Our neighbor's cats loved climbing onto the coal stove outside. The sheet metal covering, it always made that same dull clank under their weight. I glanced at my window, but saw nothing. Still, something felt off. Maybe it was because I hadn't heard the usual scurry of paws afterward. Maybe it was because the sound had come a little too late at night, later than usual. I ignored it at first, clicked on the next video, told myself it was just a cat, even though I didn't fully believe it. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a movement, a shadow. It passed my window so quickly that if I had blinked, I would have missed it. A barely, their flicker, like something moving fast just beyond the glass. My breath hitched. My first thought, probably another cat. But no, the shape was too tall. It had been upright. I sat frozen for a few seconds, straining to hear anything over the sound of my own pulse in my ears. The house was still. I glanced at my friend, still dead asleep, oblivious. I told myself it was nothing, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But a deep, uneasy instinct told me I needed to check the door, just in case. I moved slowly, careful not to make the floor creak, as if whoever, whatever, was outside could hear me. The hallway was dark, just a thin sliver of moonlight stretching across the wooden floor from a window near the kitchen. I stepped into it, heart pounding. The front door was closed, of course. But when I reached out to check the lock, my stomach dropped. The door was unlocked. I had locked it. I knew I had locked it. Hadn't I? I always did. Always. But as I stood there, staring at the unlocked bolt, I couldn't trust my own memory. I swallowed hard and reached out, slowly, to turn the lock. Click! And that's when I saw him. A face in a peephole. Right there. Inches from mine. I jerked back so violently that I nearly lost my balance. My breath caught in my throat, and my pulse thundered in my ears. The man stood completely still, his forehead pressed against the door, his one visible eye unblinking, empty. His skin was pale under the dim porch light, his mouth slightly open, lips forming silent words I couldn't hear. For a second, I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Then, the silence shattered. A voice. His voice. "Let me in. Please." I flinched at the sound. It wasn't loud. It wasn't aggressive. It was wrong. Too calm. Too level. His voice carried the weight of genuine fear, like he needed help. Desperately. But his face didn't match. There was no fear in his eyes. No tension in his expression. Just nothing. I don't know how long I stood there, rooted in place. 5 seconds? 10? His voice came again, more urgent. "Please, help me." The words should have made me feel sorry for him, but they didn't. They made my skin crawl. Something was wrong. Something was wrong. Then came a knocking. Not frantic, not forceful, just a slow, rhythmic tap. 1, 2, 3. The sound sent a jolt of terror through my spine. I took an unsteady step back, but I couldn't take my eyes off the peephole. I wasn't imagining him. He was really there. The knock stopped. Silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. Then I heard it. Footsteps behind me. I whirled around so fast, I almost tripped over my own feet. My brother stood at the edge of the hallway, squinting at me in the dim light. For a few seconds, I couldn't move. My eyes locked onto the man outside the window, my breath caught somewhere in my throat. Talp! 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 The sound was slow, deliberate. The knife's tip met the glass with an almost playful rhythm, each tap slicing through the silence. Then something in my brain snapped. I gasped, stumbling back, my body finally catching up to my fear. The movement broke whatever trance my brother had been under. What's wrong? He asked, his voice still thick with sleep. I didn't answer. I turned back toward the window, and he was gone. The man had vanished. There wasn't even a lingering shadow outside, just the empty yard bathed in the pale glow of the porch light. The wind swayed the trees gently, and for a moment, it almost felt like nothing had happened at all. But it had happened. I swallowed hard, my pulse still erratic. There was someone there. I finally managed. My voice sounded weak, like I wasn't even convinced of my own words. My brother frowned. What do you mean? I turned to him, trying to steady my breathing. There was a man outside the window. He was just standing there, looking right at me. His face darkened, his expression shifting from sleepy confusion to something more serious. What did he look like? I hesitated. Pale, blank expression. At first. Then he started smiling. I stopped myself. Like a predator. My brother's jaw tightened. He rubbed his eyes and exhaled sharply. I saw someone earlier too. His words sent a fresh wave of fear through me. What? He nodded, looking uneasy. I woke up for a second, maybe an hour ago. I thought I saw someone standing by my window. His eyes flickered toward the hallway, as if suddenly uneasy with how exposed we were. I figured I was dreaming, so I went back to sleep. We stood there in silence, the weight of his words sinking in. Neither of us had been dreaming. We needed to check the house. Moving quickly, we switched off the lights. Darkness swallowed the hallway, making every shadow feel too big, too alive. My brother led the way to the living room, where the largest window faced the front yard. We pressed ourselves against the wall, then carefully peeked through the edge of the curtain. Nothing. The yard was empty. The street beyond was still. The occasional flicker of a street lamp made the trees sway in eerie, twisting shapes, but there was no sign of him. We checked the kitchen next. My brother unlocked the back door as quietly as he could, pushing it open just enough to see onto the porch. Again, nothing, but the air outside felt wrong. It was dead still, no wind, no rustling leaves. Just a dense, suffocating silence that made my skin crawl. I didn't realize I was holding my breath until my chest started to ache. We checked every window, every possible point of entry. No footprints, no movement, nothing. It was like he had never been there at all. And then, a scream, sharp, raw, and terrified, from my room. My friend. I didn't think I ran. My brother was right behind me, his heavy footsteps thudding against the wooden floor. I shoved the door open so hard it slammed against the wall. And there he was, the man, standing just outside my window, separated from us by only a thin pane of glass. But this time, he wasn't just watching. He was grinning. That same sick, unnatural smile stretched across his face, too wide, too pleased. His eyes, they weren't blank anymore. They were focused, sharp, like a hunter sizing up its prey. My friend was curled up in the corner, gasping for breath, his face ghostly pale. His wide, terrified eyes darted between the window and us, his chest rising and falling too fast. And the man outside, he lifted his hand. The knife. Even in the dim light, I could see the way the blade gleamed. Talp! 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 The sound sent ice down my spine. I forced myself to move, to do something. My fingers scrambled for my phone, but my hand was shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. My brother had already turned, sprinting down the hall. He was calling the police. Why hadn't we done that earlier? Why hadn't I called the second I saw him at the peephole? The tapping on the window stopped. I looked up. The man tilted his head, like he was considering something. His lips parted slightly, and for a second I thought he was going to speak. Panic wrapped around my chest like a vice, squeezing the breath from my lungs. I wanted to scream, to run, to do something, but my body refused to move. I was trapped in the gaze of the man outside my window. He hadn't moved, hadn't blinked, just stood there grinning. The knife in his hand was no longer tapping against the glass, but I swore I could still hear the sound. Tap, 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 like an echo in my skull, keeping rhythm with the pounding of my heart. Then my brother was beside me, his voice cutting through the fog of terror. "Call the police," he said, shoving his phone into my trembling hands. My fingers barely worked, shaking so violently I could hardly type. I pressed the emergency dial, bringing the phone to my ear. The ringing felt like it went on forever. The man outside tilted his head, like he heard it, like he knew. For the first time, his expression shifted. Not fear, not anger, something else. Amusement. The moment the dispatcher answered, he moved. Not suddenly, not like someone caught in the act. It was slow, deliberate. He took a step back, then another. His eyes never left mine. And then, just like that, he was gone, vanished into the night, swallowed by the darkness beyond the window. For a moment, none of us moved. Then my brother snatched the phone from me. "There's a man outside our house," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. He had a knife. "We need someone here now." I barely heard the rest of the call. I was still staring at the window, half expecting him to reappear, to tap again, to press his face against the glass and grin at me. But the yard was empty. The night stretched on, silent and undisturbed, as if the man had never been there at all. The police arrived within minutes. 3 officers, their patrol car's lights painting our house in red and blue flashes. My brother and I stood frozen as they swept through the yard, flashlights cutting through the darkness. One officer took our statements while the others searched the perimeter. My friend sat slumped against the wall, pale and trembling, barely able to speak. We told him everything. The peephole, the window, the knife, the way he had disappeared the second we called for help. The officers listened, nodding, occasionally scribbling something down. When they finished checking the yard, they gathered near the front door. One of them, a tall man with a thick mustache, spoke first. "No signs of forced entry," he said. "No footprints near the windows. No sign of anyone in the area." My stomach dropped. "He was here. We all saw him. But we believe you," the officer added quickly, seeing the look on my face. "Someone was here. Maybe a drifter, maybe a break-in attempt. Could be someone checking if the house was empty." I shook my head. No, he wasn't trying to break in. He was just watching. The officer studied me for a moment, then exhaled. "That makes it worse." His words made my skin crawl. The other officers finished their sweep and confirmed what we already knew. There was no trace of him. No footprints, no dropped items, no evidence that anyone had been standing outside the house. It was like he had never been there. But we knew better. We weren't alone after that. The officers stayed with us, waiting for my parents to return home. My mother called as soon as she heard what happened, her voice shaking over the phone. They were already on their way back, her fear almost tangible through the receiver. The officers walked the house with us, checking every lock, every window. My brother and I followed in a daze, double-checking everything, even though we knew it wouldn't matter. Because the locks had been locked, the windows had been shut, and yet, somehow, he had still been there. It didn't make sense. Nothing made sense. We were escorted back to the living room, where my friend sat curled up in a blanket, barely responsive. He hadn't said a word since his scream shattered the night. I sat beside him, my mind racing. Something wasn't right. This wasn't a normal break-in. This wasn't a random trespasser. The way he moved, the way he waited. He didn't panic when we saw him. He didn't run when we called the police. He wanted us to see him. And when he left, he did it slowly, deliberately, like he was taunting us, like he knew something we didn't. I clenched my hands into fists, my nails digging into my palms. I had a horrible, suffocating feeling that this wasn't over, that it was only beginning. My parents arrived not long after, frantic and shaken. My mother pulled me into a tight hug, her hands trembling. My father, usually calm and composed, looked pale and furious as he spoke to the officers. The police promised to patrol the area for the next few nights, to keep an eye out. They reassured us that it was likely a one-time incident, that he was gone, but I didn't believe them. I didn't believe it was over. Because even after the officers left, after my parents locked the doors, after my mother insisted we all sleep in the same room for the night, I felt it. A presence. A lingering shadow. Like something unseen still pressed against the walls of her home. Like something was watching. I barely slept. And when I did, I dreamed of him. Standing outside the window. Smiling. Waiting. I thought that after that night, things would go back to normal. The police never found him. My parents double-checked the locks every evening. My brother tried to act like it was all in the past. My friend stopped coming over as often, and when he did, he never stayed after dark. But I knew it wasn't over, because the nightmares had started. The first one came 3 days after the break-in. I was back in my room, watching YouTube just like before. The house was quiet. The screen glowed against my face as I clicked on the next video. Then the tapping started. Tap, tap, tap. Slow, steady, methodical. I turned toward the window, and there he was. His face pale, pressed against the glass. That same unnatural grin stretched across his lips. His eyes locked onto mine, unblinking. He lifted his hand, raising the knife with almost lazy amusement. The blade tapped the window. Once, twice, 3 times. I wanted to move, to run, to scream, but my body wouldn't listen. He was inside now. He was standing at the foot of my bed. I still couldn't move. He raised the knife again, but this time he wasn't tapping. This time, I woke up, gasping. My sheets were damp with sweat. My heart hammered against my ribs, so hard it hurt. My fingers dug into the mattress. Just a dream. Just a dream. But as I sat there, struggling to catch my breath, I realized something. My window was open. The curtains swayed slightly in the night air. The latch was undone, even though I knew I had locked it before bed. I stared at it for a long time, my mind racing. I got up, hands shaking, and slid it shut. I locked it. Then I checked the door. Then the closet. Then under the bed. Nothing. I climbed back under the covers, but I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The nightmares kept coming. Sometimes he was outside the window. Sometimes he was inside. Sometimes I heard his voice. Let me in, please. Sometimes I dreamed I did let him in. And those were the worst. I woke up exhausted, drenched in sweat, my body stiff from how tense I had been in my sleep. But the dreams weren't the worst part. It was the little things. Things I couldn't explain. The window left cracked open in the morning, despite me checking it 5 times before bed. My closet door slightly ajar when I knew I had closed it. Objects in my room, small things like my phone, my keys, my lamp, shifted just an inch out of place. The creeping, gnawing feeling that someone had been there. That I wasn't alone. My brother told me I was being paranoid. Your brain's messing with you, he said. It's trauma. We went through something messed up. You just need time. I wanted to believe him. But how do you explain the feeling of breath on your skin in the middle of the night? The way the hairs on the back of your neck stand up like someone is right behind you? The way shadows seem to shift just as you turn your head? I started double-checking the locks, then triple-checking. I started sleeping with my bedroom light on. And still, the feeling never left me. The fear crawled under my skin, settling deep in my bones. Every night, before I climbed into bed, I would stand in the middle of my room and listen. The silence wasn't comforting anymore. It felt like something was waiting, watching. That night, I heard it again. The tapping. Faint. Soft. I was lying in bed, my body tense, staring at the ceiling when the sound came. Tap. 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 I stopped breathing. I didn't move. The curtains were drawn, but I knew. I knew he was there. He was standing just outside the window, watching, waiting. The air felt thick, suffocating. My fingers gripped the sheets so tightly my knuckles ached. I had 2 choices. Stay frozen. Pretend it wasn't happening. Or look, I didn't want to. Every instinct screamed at me not to. But something else, something deeper, curiosity, fear, something primal, forced me to move. Slowly, heart pounding, I turned my head toward the window. I reached out with trembling fingers and pulled the curtain back. Just an inch, just enough to see. My breath caught in my throat. There in the glass, I saw his reflection. But he wasn't outside. He was inside, standing just behind me, right over my shoulder, smiling. I spun around so fast, I nearly fell out of bed. My hands scrambled for anything to defend myself, my chest tightening with terror. But the room was empty. There was nothing there. Nothing but a single, wet footprint on the floor, right beside my bed. I never told my parents about the footprint. I wanted to. God, I needed to. But the words wouldn't come. If I told them, they'd either believe me, and that thought terrified me more than anything, or they'd say I was imagining things, that I was losing my mind. So instead, I did the only thing I could think of. I begged them to put bars on the windows. I told them I couldn't sleep, that I was scared he'd come back. I told them I needed it. I must have looked bad, hollow-eyed, shaking, my voice thin with exhaustion, because they didn't argue. Within a week, our house was covered in steel. Every window, every possible entry point reinforced. Extra locks on the doors. Motion lights installed outside. My mother reassured me. "Now we're safe," she said. "He can't get in." I nodded, pretending her words comforted me. But deep down I knew it had never been about getting in. It had never been about breaking a lock or climbing through a window. He had been inside before, and if he wanted to, he would be again. The nightmares didn't stop, not for a long time. I still saw him standing at my window, that grin stretched wide. I still woke up gasping, drenched in sweat, convinced I'd find him at the foot of my bed. But every time I woke up, every time I sat up, heart hammering, there was nothing. The bar stayed in place. The locks remained sealed. I was alone. Over time, the dreams faded. Not all at once, but gradually. The fear didn't vanish, but it dulled, becoming something quieter, something I could ignore if I tried hard enough. But the habit never left me. Every night, even years later, I checked the doors, the windows, every lock, 3 times, always 3, just in case. It wasn't until I turned 20 that I saw the article. I was at a friend's house, half listening as we scrolled through random horror stories online. I wasn't really paying attention until one headline caught my eye. The Watcher, Unsolved Cases of the Silent Intruder. My stomach clenched. I clicked the link. The article was old, maybe 10 years, but the details felt too familiar. A string of break-ins across the state, spanning nearly a decade. But nothing was ever stolen. No signs of forced entry. No broken windows, no missing valuables. Just one thing in common. The residents would wake up in the middle of the night and find a man standing in their room. Watching, never moving, never speaking, just watching. Some saw him standing at the foot of their bed. Others found him in the doorway. A few, only a few, reported the same sound. Talp, talp, talp. Rhythmic, slow, methodical. Then, after a while, he disappeared. No sign of entry. No trace left behind. As if he had never been there at all. I felt sick. My hands trembled as I scrolled further, my breath coming shallow and quick. And then I saw the last paragraph. It said the break-ins had stopped, abruptly, without warning, and the police believed they knew why. Because around the time the intrusions ended, a series of murders began. The article didn't go into detail, but the implications were clear. The man had escalated. Watching had no longer been enough. I sat there, frozen, my pulse pounding in my ears. He hadn't just disappeared that night. He had moved on, and for the first time in 4 years, I realized something that made my blood run cold. Maybe the reason he left, maybe the reason he didn't come back, was because that night he had found someone else. Someone new to watch. Someone else to stand over in the dark. And this time, maybe he didn't leave.